A proposal is currently being considered by the U.S. Postal Service to sell its building in downtown Berkeley, California, and relocate its services to another location. This is just one city that is feeling the impact of a crippling financial crisis currently affecting the Postal Service. In fiscal year 2012, it lost approximately $15.9 billion. Now, thousands of buildings may be sold and thousands of workers laid off, in what USPS says is an attempt to save itself, but critics argue is a step toward privatization. It's commonly understood that the internet and e-communication are causing the demise of the Postal Service, but that's not the full story. What seems to be at the root of the crisis is actually a little-known law passed in 2006.
Congress passed the Postal Accountability Act that required the Postal Service, no other federal agency other than the Postal Service, to pre-fund the health care benefits for retirees 75 years into the future, which means that they are currently funding health benefits for retirees who haven't even been born yet.
It's an onerous requirement that no other agency, private or public, has to go through. Now bear in mind that we already set aside $2.5 billion every single year to already pay for that. So there was really no reason for us to have to pay in advance.
That essentially was a cyanide pill that was fed to the Postal Service, which seems to have been designed to drive it out of business.
Postal revenue has taken a slight drop over the past few years, but until now the Postal Service has been able to survive solely from its own revenue, receiving absolutely no U.S. tax dollars, as stipulated by the 1970 Postal Reorganization Act. However, the pension pre-funding is a mandatory requirement, and so in an attempt to address its budget shortfall, USPS has begun a program of drastic restructuring. One effort underway is a massive reduction in its workforce. Currently, the Postal Service provides around 550,000 middle-class jobs, but actions proposed by the Postmaster General could cut the workforce down to approximately 300,000, which union representatives say would have a devastating effect not only on workers and their families, but on the overall U.S. economy as well. In addition to curtailing labor costs, current plans likely include the closing of around 3,700 post offices, although at other times it has been suggested that up to 15,000 locations may be considered for closure, almost half of the 32,000 USPS operates.
If we can cut our costs behind the retail counter, which is all this added space, and stay in business by offering our customers their products and services that they need, we'll be able to stay in business.
But unions and community organizations say it is hardly a solution to the budget problems. They stress this one-time cash injection will never be able to be repeated, so it's hard to see how this will help alleviate the ongoing pension payments. Additionally, services are often being relocated from the sold buildings to new rented locations, meaning ongoing monthly payments often estimated at a cost greater than maintaining the already owned buildings. Activists argue this is part of an ongoing divestiture of assets, that along with $12 billion of annual outsourcing, is a significant step toward the privatization of the U.S. Postal Service. While USPS denies there is a concerted effort to privatize, privatization does have its strong advocates. Tad DeHaven, for instance, of the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank, believes in full privatization. DeHaven sees the current measures as merely a band-aid, and the entire government-run model as a failure.
See, my concern is that if we don't privatize, eventually we're going to go back to the days of federal taxpayers being on the hook. The one-size-fits-all model where you have 6-day delivery to every home in the country for a fixed price, it just doesn't make any economic sense. And so what I envision is eventually consumers and customers basically dictating what they want, and entrepreneurs figuring out how to satisfy those wants and needs.
Also championing paths towards privatization are UPS and FedEx. Already, FedEx is the Postal Service's #1 private contractor, transporting express, priority, and first-class mail. In 2011, the company earned postal revenues of $1.495 billion, an increase of $122 million over 2010. Like Tad DeHaven, FedEx CEO Frederick W. Smith is also a member of the Cato Institute, and in the past has been on its board of directors. In 1999, long before the Postal Service's current crisis, Smith testified before a congressional committee urging it to consider privatization. Closing down the Postal Service, he stated, like any other government agency that has outlived its usefulness, is an option that ought to be considered seriously. In response to these outright demands for privatization, Postal Service advocates assert the current crisis is manufactured, not a result solely of a poor business model. The additional measures, they insist, are only further debilitating the Postal Service and making it less functional, thereby setting itself up for a further loss of revenue.
If, for instance, you had 5 people on the window, you may now only have 4. So the lines get longer and the wait time increases. It's the same thing with station closures. The farther you have to go, the more I think you're going to look for an alternative, which would cut our revenue.
They're liquidating everything in a desperate effort to stay afloat for a little bit longer. But in fact, actually, it's just increasing the death spiral, because in doing so, they're decreasing the public service and driving the customers away.
During this process, some private contractors will do quite well off the ongoing USPS fiscal crisis. CBRE, for example, is the world's largest commercial real estate broker, chaired by San Francisco billionaire Richard Blum, husband of Senator Dianne Feinstein. Last year, CBRE won a contract from USPS to be the sole manager of its property sales, as well as an advisor on which properties should be sold.
And there seems to be a conflict of interest in that, because obviously, because it gets a percentage from these deals, it's actually profiting from the sale of high-end post offices. But it also apparently is arranging the leases for the space into which the post office moves. It abandons buildings that it owns and moves into property that it doesn't own, for which it will then be paying rent. And so in all these ways, CBRE is profiting.
But USPS dismisses any possible conflict of interest CBRE may have in performing its services.
All they're doing is recommending. That's what we hire them for, not to make the decision for us. We make our own decisions.
Activists agree the Postal Service needs to adjust its model if it hopes to succeed in the future. Instead of scaling back, however, they believe a reinvestment in the institution would lead to a revitalization and bring customers and revenue back to the Postal Service. But their immediate priority is a congressional repeal of the tremendous burden that is the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act.
Congress created this mess, and the real resolution to the financial problems of the Postal Service is going to have to lie in Congress.
Meanwhile, the downtown Berkeley Post Office, a nationally registered historic landmark, may soon be up for sale. Under the proposal, the building would be sold and current services would be relocated to a leased storefront. But the news has not gone over well in Berkeley.
The community has been actually up in arms about it in the way that very few other towns have been. We're not going to let them sell our post office, because we're actually going to make this a public issue across the country. And Berkeley is the place where we draw the line.
The post office represents a central point for that community. It's an identity. And when it becomes a personal issue, people will come out and they will voice their concerns. But we have to understand that while we will listen to their objectives, we also have to weigh them against our fiduciary responsibilities to keep this business in place.
As activists in Berkeley and elsewhere across the country attempt to alter the Postal Service's current course, what is clear is that unless something changes, the likely path will result in drastically less public ownership of assets, thousands fewer unionized employees, and more outsourcing. Or in other words, a semi-privatized U.S. Postal Service. That is, of course, if it can stay in business. Reporting from Berkeley, California, this is David Zlutnick for the Real News Network.